It's good to be back on campus. Well, this is nicer. Last time I was in this room, I was decrying BDS from about right over there, while the entire USAC board sat here and tried to explain why it was that Israel deserved divestment, but Iran didn't. I also want to thank the university for providing all of the security arrangements. I wish that they had done more to allow more people in the room, because one of the issues that we had here tonight was that they wanted to make sure that everybody was registered, so they had turned away several hundred people a little bit earlier. There were about 1,400 people who signed up who couldn't come, apparently, but hopefully that can be rectified next time. I haven't actually seen this many police officers since the UCLA basketball team went shopping for sunglasses. And the protests outside, they do make me feel welcome, about as welcome as I was, come to think of it, last time I went here. So nothing has changed, it seems, in the last, let's see, I graduated in 2004, so in the last 13 years. I'm always grateful to UCLA as an institution. I graduated from here. It allowed me to go on and do, I think, important things. My wife graduated from UCLA. She graduated from UCLA Medical School. My sister graduated from UCLA, so this definitely is our home school. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the rise of campus fascism and why that fascism seems to have come almost solely from the left here on campus. And I use a model that some people on the left are familiar with to discuss what exactly fascism constitutes. In 1950, there was a Marxist theorist. His name was Theodor Adorno. He was a member of the so-called Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School was a group of expatriate German intellectuals with a Marxist bent. They left in the late 1920s, early 1930s from Germany to come to the United States, trying to flee the rising tide of Hitlerism. And Adorno, along with a couple of other University of Berkeley researchers, he wrote a book called The Authoritarian Personality. And this book has become sort of a hallmark in the literature of authoritarianism in terms of fascism. People have used this book to describe what makes somebody authoritarian. Adorno's theory was basically that individuals who have fascistic tendencies also tend to come from authoritarian backgrounds or tend to hold authoritarian beliefs. Now, some of this has been proved to be a little bit flawed. But the general framework is not entirely wrong when it comes to describing a certain mindset that exists among people who are more likely to want to quash dissent. The problem for Adorno is that because Adorno was a member of the left, he was deliberately trying to obfuscate the fascism that so often comes from the left. He was trying to define fascism in a way that actually excluded people of the left. So never mind that Hitler and the Nazis were technically, if you would put them on the American political spectrum, they're of the American left. They're of the European right, because Europe doesn't operate according to the same guidelines that the United States does. So in Germany, Hitler's movement was of the right because it was in contrast to the Marxist left. But if you had moved Hitler's centralized government perspective, everything from healthcare to finance, into the spectrum of American politics, he would actually end up somewhere on the American left. But Adorno felt the necessity to draw a hard distinction between Hitlerism and Marxism, and so his description of what authoritarianism was excluded authoritarianism of the left. But if you remove some of the leftist bias of his descriptions of what makes for an authoritarian personality, it's a pretty good look at why people attempt to shut down debate. What exactly makes somebody want to go out there and violently protest? Not just go out there and protest, like I guess there are maybe 15 people out there tonight doing that, but those people are fine. I mean, the Democratic Socialists of America, all 9 of them, I hope they're having fun. But I'm glad that some of you showed up. By the way, thank you for showing up. You know, quick show of hands, because I want to give a round of applause to people who show up who disagree with me. Before we start, how many people here disagree with me? Just to start. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it. It does take some guts to actually come to an arena where most of the crowd's going to disagree with you, or the speaker's going to disagree with you, and actually come to discuss and debate the issues, as opposed to going outside and carrying around signs and making lots of noise and pretending you're important. So I want to go through Adorno's authoritarian personality. I want to go through what he thought were sort of the 9 elements of what makes someone authoritarian. This is called the California F scale, is really what it was called, because it's called the fascist scale. And there's a professor named Adrian Furnham, who's a professor of psychology at the University College in London, and he's sort of broken it down into these 9 elements. So let's strip these elements of their leftist bias, and then we can talk about how they apply on today's campuses. So the first element is what this professor and what Adorno called conventionalism, rigid adherence to conventional middle-class values. So for example, obedience and respect for authority are the most important virtues children should learn. Now, obviously, you can see that there's a rather left-leaning perspective on how children ought to be raised, the idea that that obedience is not necessary in children. As the father of a 3.5-year-old and a 1.5-year-old, I can promise you that my authoritarianism goes without question in my house, at least for their ages, because if it didn't, they would be dead. I mean, that's just the way that it works, particularly with young children. If they don't listen to you, then they kill themselves. They are very difficult to handle. But with all of that said, this idea that conventionalism is restricted to people of the right, that conventionalism is just about bourgeois middle-class values, is just not true. Conventionalism is about adhering to the moral standard that is promulgated at the time. So on campus, conventionalism is not of the right. I'm a dissenter here. Now, normally, across America, if I'm in Alabama, then I'm a conventionalist, right? If I'm in Texas, I'm a conventionalist. Although if I were in Alabama, I wouldn't vote for Roy Moore. But conventionalism depends on where you are at the time. So if you're inside an institution like UCLA, where the conventional view is a very left-leaning one, then your orthodoxy of obedience to authority is conventional. So if you believe that the campus has to be ruled from above by the administrators who are going to tell you what's right and wrong, you are a conventionalist. Right? So the inherited values are not conventional middle-class ones here on college campuses. They are inherited values of the left. And as you see here on campus, obedience and respect for authority to the left is required. Right? If you dissent, then it is very likely 3 and 4 times they attempt to impose a policy where you have to pay a specific security fee if less than 70% of the people who show up in a crowd are from the university campus. 3 out of the 4 times that policy has ever been used, it'll be used against the dissenters. Because obedience to the left, obedience to authority is key. So obviously this element of authoritarianism exists on the left on college campuses. Second element is authoritarian submission, uncritical acceptance of authority. So this professor writes, young people sometimes get rebellious ideas, but as they grow up, they ought to get over them and settle down. So this ties in with this peculiar perspective that has arisen on some parts of the more mainstream left now, particularly on campuses, that dissent is violence. That speech is violence. When I was at Berkeley, there's actually a crowd outside literally chanting, speech is violence. Right? That there's this uncritical acceptance of the authority structure, and if I did not accept that authority structure, I was committing an act of verbal terrorism. This is why there's always an attempt to shut me down when I come on campus, because the idea is that the things that I say are so inherently dangerous, they're so dangerous and so scary that they provide a challenge to the existing mode of authority. I mean, I sort of hope they do, but they aren't that dangerous. Okay, none of my followers have gone out and beaten anyone up. None of my followers have gone out and killed anyone. None of my followers are breaking ATMs. This is not what my followers do. And if they do, then I immediately disown them because they're not my followers, because this is nothing that I preach. But on campus, the idea that you have to uncritically accept authority is obviously true, right? This is why you have speech codes and conduct codes and every other kind of codes. It's why you have kangaroo courts where due process of law is not necessary. Kangaroo courts ranging from political agitprop courts, where if you say something that offends somebody, you get dragged in front of a court for some sort of punishment, to even some of the Title IX courts. You see people like Laura Kipnis at Northwestern University, who's on the left, being dragged in front of a Title IX court for daring to talk in politically incorrect terms about sexual harassment. And the third element is authoritarian aggression, a tendency to condemn anyone who violates these conventional norms. And the idea that a person who has bad manners and habits and breeding can hardly expect to get along with decent people. This is probably the most common element you see on campus, this idea that all people who disagree with the prevailing leftist superstructure of thought, they must be cast out of decent society. These people are not, you can't even talk with them. They shouldn't be invited to the cool kid parties. You shouldn't have discussions with them. They are just bad people, right? Because they disagree with you. And we know that if you accept the authority of the other idea, then disagreeing with that idea makes you outside the bounds of conventional society. I mean, it's the equivalent of walking into a dinner party and pooping on the floor. If you go in there and you just break all of the rules, then you're not welcome in polite society. And this is how conservatives are treated on college campuses. This is the cheap method of converting conservatives into being people on the left. Because if you want to go to the cool kid parties, if you want to be able to associate with your fellow students, if you want to be seen as a decent person and not as a bad person, then you have to accept this authority. And if you don't, then we will use these methods of social ostracism in order to convince you not that we're right, but that you are evil. And the fourth element is intraception, which is rejection of weakness or sentimentality. So you see this a lot in sort of fascist countries, the idea that the businessman and the manufacturer are much more important to society than the artist and the professor. So you see this, Hitler is very much associated with this. You see this also actually in the Soviet Union, the idea that art is secondary to work. This is one of the elements that Adorno thought was key to authoritarianism. But what he missed was the underlying thought structure for why that is. The reason that so many fascist regimes don't like the artist and the poet is because they're the dissenters. It's because the artist and the poet are the people who look at the world in a different and a new way. Artists and poets are people who make a life out of suggesting that there's another way of looking at things. And that's why authoritarian regimes can't accept them. The authoritarian regimes are perfectly happy to sponsor art that agrees with the regime. I mean, this is why famous conductor Wilhelm Furtwängler was a fan of the Nazis, at least for a time. And the idea was that they were helping him out. I mean, they sponsored opera in Germany. They sponsored art in Germany. They sponsored particular types of art. The Soviet Union did the same. So it wasn't all artists who were thought to be wrong. It was the artists who didn't agree with the regime. So again, this comes down to compliance with the regime. This one, this fifth element, is one that I think is particularly important on campus. This is the superstition and stereotypy, the belief in mystical determinants of action, rigid categorical thinking, this idea that like someday it will be shown that astrology can explain a lot of things. So superstition dominates on campus because, again, once you accept authority, you also have to accept the superstition that comes with this authority. So this is why it is taught in superstitiously rigid ways on college campuses that you must never ask questions that are politically incorrect. Superstitions like the idea that men can become women and women can become men. Right? There's no biological foundation to this idea. There's biological foundation to the idea of people who are intersex. There's biological foundation to the idea of people who have gender dysphoria. There's no biological foundation to the idea that a man who believes he is a woman is actually a woman. There's no biological sex-based foundation for this. It doesn't exist because it's not true. Okay, but this is accepted as a fact of life. It is a superstition that we all must accept, just like walking under a ladder is going to bring you bad luck. Man is not a man, a woman is not a woman. All of this is just gender cisnormative nonsense. Right? You see this with regard to questions about science in global warming. Now, I happen to believe that the world is warming, but I think that there are serious questions to be asked about the sensitivity of the climate to carbon emissions. These questions are being asked by a wide variety of scientists right now. There are questions to be asked about the best method for tamping that down, whether the market is the best method. But if you ask any of these questions, then you are guilty of violating the superstition. You have violated the religion. I mean, this is treated as religious tradition on the left, these elements. Superstitious religious traditions. Okay, and as a religious person, I know what a religion looks like. Okay, this is what a religion looks like. This idea that if you violate the tenets of the priesthood, then you must be cast out into the outer darkness. Okay, sixth element, power and toughness, preoccupation with dominance over others. There's no question that this exists on college campuses. Antifa is the most obvious example of this. The reason that it was important for folks like me to go to Berkeley is because Antifa had basically suggested that we have locked down, this is our campus, right? This is when you hear chants like, whose campus? Our campus. Right, well, it's not just your campus. In fact, my tax dollars are sponsoring you morons to go to this campus. But power and toughness are the sort of underlying notion for a lot of folks on the campus left, that we dominate this campus, that we are the powers on this campus, and we must not be challenged. For all the talk about pacifism, the least pacifistic people on campus are the ones who are out there beating up supporters of mine who want to come to my speeches. The seventh element that backs authoritarianism, the authoritarian personality, is destructiveness and cynicism, a generalized feeling of hostility and anger. Yes, this exists on the left. In fact, the entire basis for intersectional theory lies in this destructiveness and cynicism. That's intersectionality in a nutshell. Intersectionality is the theory that we can basically decide how valuable your view is based on the group to which you belong. Because the group to which you belong has certain grievances against the entire structure of America, and those grievances have to be taken seriously. We have to be angry. It doesn't matter if you can show that you were victimized or not. All that matters is that you can say that the system victimized your group. And the system and we can create a scale. We can create a scale of victimhood. And this is what intersectionality does. It basically says that gay people are above black people, who are above Hispanic people, who are above women, who are above Native Americans, who are above Jews, who are above Asians, who are above white people, white males particularly, the straight white males. So if you're at the very bottom of that intersectionality grid, then your opinion is of meaningless value because you have no reason to be angry. But you do have reason to be angry if you're a member of one of these other groups. This generalized feeling of anger and hostility, it doesn't have to be justified by statistics. It doesn't have to be justified by evidence. It doesn't even have to be justified by solid anecdotal evidence that can be backed up by evidence. If you're angry, there must be a reason for it. And therefore, we all have to kowtow to your anger. Subjectivity overrules objectivity. You don't have to prove anything to anyone so long as you claim some sort of credit in one of these groups. This means that your views are justified. And therefore, if your views are justified, everybody else's views are unjustified based on the nature of the group to which they belong. Eighth, projectivity. There's a tendency to project inner emotions and impulses outward. And the idea that, for example, most people don't realize how much our lives are controlled by plots hatched in secret places. There is no more conspiratorial group in America today than leftists on college campuses. They believe that the economy is rigged against them. Right? Income inequality means that Bill Gates is secretly working with Warren Buffett to rig the economy against them. Is the Bernie Sanders perspective on economics that is almost as ignorant as Bernie Sanders' perspective on foreign policy. And the idea that income inequality is an effective capitalism, when capitalism has literally raised 50% of people on planet Earth from abject poverty, is inane. But this conspiratorial thinking that a bunch of people got together to rig the system on their own behalf is a hallmark of leftist thinking on college campuses. White privilege, another one of these hallmarks. This idea that there's a big conspiracy to keep you down. If you're a black person in America, there's a big conspiracy. People like me are getting together in our Protocols of the Elders of Zion meetings after davening on Fridays, and we are figuring out how to keep the black man down. This is supremely stupid. And not only is it supremely stupid, it's supremely counterproductive, because it's teaching individuals in the freest country in the history of planet Earth that they can't get ahead if they work hard, that if they abide by standards of decency and reason, that they still can't get ahead because some conspiracy is out there to stop them from succeeding, that people like me care about stopping people from succeeding as opposed to getting the government out of the way so that you can succeed on your own. This sort of conspiratorial thinking dominates the idea that women are victimized by American society in terms of pay. That out there's this structure of men who are just keeping women down in terms of pay, instead of looking at actual statistical evidence that shows that in the 50 major cities in the United States, women are actually on average paid more than men when they get out of college and don't have babies. And then they have the same amount of work experience and are working the same number of hours. All of this is conspiratorial thinking. And by the way, I don't want to suggest that this exists only on the left. Some of these elements do exist on parts of the right, and I'm happy to talk about that probably in the Q&A. But this conspiratorial thinking, this idea that the world is rigged against you, runs directly counter to the free will-based notions of the Founding Fathers and the Constitution of the United States. Finally, what Adorno said was the ninth element of authoritarianism was an over-focus on sex. There's this bizarre preoccupation with sex, the preoccupation with proper sexual conduct. Now, people like Adorno like to put this in the litany because obviously Theodore Adorno was a Marxist and he believed in the breakdown of the family structure and he thought that the rigid patriarchy of marriage was binding people in. But if you look at America today, the people who tend to be a lot more obsessed with sex are not the people on the right. They're not people like me. I'm a libertarian. I really don't care. I mean, do what you want in the privacy of your own home as long as I don't have to pay for it. It doesn't bother me one iota. And my religious perspective on that, here's the nice thing about my religious perspective on your sexual behavior. It's a free country. You can think I'm an idiot. You can ignore me. But I don't feel the government has any role whatsoever in regulating what you do behind closed doors. But the left seems to have this bizarre preoccupation with everything sexual. This bizarre preoccupation with what I think about your sex life. That I have to be forced to agree with your sex life. I have to be forced as a religious person to bake that cake. I have to be forced as a religious person to allow my church or my synagogue to give the okay to behavior that I don't find appropriate. If there's one group in America that is preoccupied with foisting certain sexual standards on everyone else, it is certainly the left, and that is certainly true on campus. Places like the UC system where they're promulgating no means no policies, which essentially say that you have to have like a 50-point checklist every time you want to have sex. Okay, I am as prudish as anyone on earth. I was known for many years as the Virgin Ben. Right? This was legitimately my nickname online for most of my early career until I got married and lost my virginity to my wife. Okay, the fact is that when it comes to this idea that that sex is going to be done with a lawyer on the side of the room taking notes, this is not how sex is done, folks. And that, which is why, by the way, I think that sex should be done in the context of marriage. It's why I'm a big proponent of marriage, because it's one of the things that it is done at that point within the bounds of a contract, actually, and you don't need a lawyer. That's one of the nice things. All of these elements add up to a field that is ripe for recruitment when it comes to shutting down those who disagree. Because all of these elements exist on the campus left. Again, Adorno wanted to restrict this to the right because he was a partisan. But if you don't restrict it to the right, if you actually broaden these elements out to encompass all of politics, you see that a lot of these authoritarian elements exist on the left. And intolerance is the ultimate outcome. Dissent has to be silenced. People like me have to run through hoops in order to speak. The administration will try to determine whether I'm guilty of hate crimes for speaking what I think is the truth, for speaking in reasonable terms. I asked earlier how many of the people on the left were here, and there are some people who are here. I haven't seen any of them running out of the room with their hair on fire or committing suicide in the room because of what I'm saying. It seems like they can all get along just fine. It seems like they're all mentally strong enough at one of the best colleges in America that they can handle a little bit of disagreement, which is good, because that's how the country is supposed to work. But that, unfortunately, does not tend to be the rising tide on the left. Instead, the idea is to even lend credence to people like me, a mainstream conservative, to even lend credence to people like me by showing up would be to grant credibility to a perspective that must be quashed at the earliest opportunity. The Founding Fathers thought differently from all of this. The Founding Fathers were right. They thought in terms of individualism. Okay, they thought that you had a right to speak freely, not because all opinions are equal. They weren't moral relativists. They didn't think that all opinions were correct. They didn't think that all perspectives were correct. They didn't think any of that. But what the Founding Fathers did believe is that we were all individually made in the image of God, and that came along with certain inalienable rights. And one of those inalienable rights was the right to exercise our free will and our reason in coming up with arguments, and to express those arguments in order to convince others. This is something that the founders deeply believed. This is what the First Amendment is all about, and this is what undergirded all of the ideas of the free government. And they were certain, by the way, that if left to our own devices, that social institutions properly supported by the community could fill a gap left by a non-tyrannical government. Right? In order to force people to be virtuous, folks like Aristotle talked about having an overbearing government that would basically cause virtue. And the Founding Fathers disagreed with that. They said, well, that ignores the fact that virtue has to be an exercise of free will. That's why we need social institutions to fill those gaps, but we need a government that doesn't impede people in pursuing their own free will. Okay, that is the best way. And American conservatism is not authoritarian. American conservatism is not Hitlerian. American conservatism is not Marxist. It's not authoritarian leftism. American conservatism is about individualism. It's the opposite of the American left and the campus left. That's why our campuses require hundreds of police officers every time I speak. It's why, I don't know how much money this campus is speaking just to have me here. I spoke here 2 years ago with no security. Now when I come, I have to have literally dozens and dozens and dozens of police officers showing up at taxpayer expense, which of course is why I pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in the state in tax. But the good news is I pay for myself. But the bad news is that whenever the left authoritarian mindset predominates on campus, it quashes the debate. So that's why I'm so glad that I get to speak to you here tonight. It's why I'm glad that the university at least did its job in allowing me to come speak again. I wish that they had done more to allow more people in the room, because I know that there were hundreds of more people who wanted to show up and hear. But I'm really grateful to all of you for showing up and taking a night off from partying and drinking to come out and hear a differing perspective. Thanks so much, and I'm excited to hear your questions. So I believe that there are microphones at the sides of the rooms, correct?
Yeah, we're actually doing 2 lines on this side of the room, so everyone that has a question, please file over here into 2 lines, and we have orange tape to mark off where you need to stop.
And as always, I do have one rule, which I forgot to mention to the BRs, which, by the way, I'm really happy that the Bruin Republicans have grown to such a size, the campus conservatives have grown to such a size. When I was here, it was like me and 3 other people. But if you disagree with me, if you're on the left, raise your hand and get to go to the front of the line. That's the rule.
And guys, for the sake of time, I'm going to limit your question to 30 seconds, and I'm going to hold onto the microphone through the entirety of you asking your question to make sure. And when you ask your question, please don't walk in front of the stage. Walk back to your seat to the way you came.
Hello there. So I was mainly doing some research with one of my friends who is studying urban planning, and I'm not sure to what extent does this question have to directly pertain to the idea of...
It does not.
Okay.
Anything under the sun I will answer.
All right. So
except about my sex life, which is none of your business.
Oh, okay. So, all
but
right.
it's awesome, by the way.
Oh. All right.
Yay, monogamy. Okay, sorry.
So what I was thinking about is I was doing research about the homeless people who live in Sacramento, and sort of like addressing the issues of, I guess, there are a lot of people who speak in advocacy groups that are trying to basically prevent ordinances from moving these people out of these communities. They're living sort of like in
Homeless encampments.
Yeah, homeless encampments and stuff. So I was just wondering, what do you believe is the conservative approach towards perhaps producing housing or programs that get these sort of people off the streets and like?
Okay, so first of all, I don't believe that the vast majority of people who are homeless because of a lack of affordable housing. There are homeless shelters that people can go to. There are also places in the United States that are not Los Angeles where the rent is not nearly as expensive as it is in places like Los Angeles, and building government-sponsored housing has been a failure in curing homelessness virtually everywhere that it's been tried, because there are a lot of people who don't want to abide by the rules of particular homeless housing. When they've tried this in Seattle, for example, then one of two things has happened. Either they've set standards that say no drugs, no alcohol, and then a lot of people don't want to be there, or they don't set those standards and the place gets wrecked. So this has been a serious problem. There are places like Utah, I believe, that have tried certain government-funded programs that seem to be a little bit more successful. The chief problem, as I view it, with regard to homelessness, is that there has been tremendous underfunding, particularly of mental illness outreach programs. A huge number of people who are on the streets are mentally ill and have serious mental illness, and that is largely due to the federalization of the mental illness industry since the 1960s, and it needs to be returned to the local level, and local communities need to take responsibility for that problem. I don't believe that people have a right to sleep on the streets. I don't believe that people have a right to clog the public thoroughfares. I don't believe that people have the right to poop in public. I don't believe any of these things. And so in order to keep a safe community for people, we ought to take care of people who legitimately can't take care of themselves, but by the same token, you don't get to live on the street just because you say you want to live on the street. Thanks.
Hey Ben, how's it going? So I guess my question's pretty quick, but what is an issue for you that you've changed your position on most frequently, or if nothing comes to mind, what's a position you've changed most recently?
Okay, so the two positions where I've changed my position that I can recall, well, three. So the three positions that I can recall are: I used to be much more stringent with regard to legalization of marijuana. I no longer care about that issue, mainly because I see that the government sucks at everything. So I think that there is a solid case to be made that, with regard to the opioid epidemic, the government has a role in preventing people from obtaining substances to which they are addicted and can't get off. But marijuana doesn't seem to me to fulfill all those criteria. I think that it damages teenage brains. I think that you're stupid if you use it regularly, and you should stop. I think you're wasting your life, but I think that people have a right to be stupid and waste their lives if they want to. It's a free country. As far I think that the second issue is with regard to same-sex marriage. I'm still anti-same-sex marriage from a social point of view. I think that heterosexual marriage is the only relationship that actually has positive value that is measurable to society. There may be advantages to civil unions over non-civil unions, but that's not marriage in the traditional sense, which is about production and rearing of children. I've changed my position not with regard to that, but with regard to the government. So I used to believe that the government had a role in regulating marriage. I no longer believe that, again, because it comes back to my original premise that the government sucks at everything. And the government's attempts to sponsor traditional marriage have not only failed, they've backfired, because now you're seeing same-sex marriage enshrined alongside traditional marriage at the government level, which is going to end with crackdowns on religious institutions that refuse to abide by the government's definition of marriage. And that scares me, and I don't like it. And so I'm libertarian on this issue, and I think the government should get completely out of the business of marriage, and it should just be a contractual relationship between two people. That is what it is in the Jewish community, right? I have my ketubah, which is my contract, my marriage contract with my wife, and that's the only one that mattered to me. When I got our state marriage contract, it meant nothing to me. We got it a couple months before we were Jewishly married. The Jewish marriage one meant everything to me because it meant I could finally have sex with her. So that's the that's another area. I've also changed my position. When you're 19, you tend to be much more radical with regard to your foreign policy, your belief in foreign policy utopianism. I'm far less utopian on foreign policy than I used to be in terms of issues that can be quote-unquote solved. And so I used to advocate measures with regard to the Israeli-Arab conflict, and I no longer advocate and haven't advocated for years and have openly denounced. I think that that's an intractable conflict that is basically only going to be a continuing intractability with defense on the side of the Israelis until the end of time, is my basic perspective on that. But that is a shift from earlier positions I'd advocated, which I now think are immoral.
First of all, it's a pleasure to be here with you, Mr. Shapiro. My question is, will you ever bury the hatchet with Milo Yiannopoulos? And can we expect maybe a debate between you and him, or even maybe something better like you two collaborating on common issues and speaking to a bunch of people like right now?
No. First of all, I'm glad to see you're a White Sox fan, so am I. But as far as the Milo issue, I have no time for someone who flirts with the neo-Nazis of the alt-right. I have no time for somebody who sends tweets to me of black children on the day that my child is born to demonstrate that I'm a cuck. I have no time for somebody who holds a book party with midgets wearing my name tag and I mean, I guess it's somewhat funny. And bibs that say, "It's my bris, I can cry if I want to," because that's actually just pure anti-Semitic trope. I think I've been saying for a long time that Milo does not represent conservatism. And yeah, by the way, I have no tolerance for somebody who implies that it's good for children when they are raped by adults. So there's that too. So I have many criticisms of Milo, and I don't see him as being a valuable member of any movement to which I belong, and I haven't for well over a year. Final note on that, sorry, before I finish. Anti-left does not mean conservative. Okay, Milo is anti-left. That does not mean you are conservative.
How's it going? How's it going, Ben? So you talked about how you came here 2 years ago and spoke, and how there wasn't really any kind of big protest going on trying to stop you, like you've seen happen at Berkeley, and even here, the 15 people you mentioned were outside. And so I was wondering, do you think that the big political climate change where they're not, like a lot of leftists haven't let conservative speakers come on campus and such, do you think it has more to do with the Obama administration or the Trump administration?
I think it has more to do with Obama. The reason I can say that with certainty is because the first major protest against me was in February 2016, before Trump had even won the nomination. So that was at Cal State Los Angeles, and there was basically a near riot there. They had helicopters flying, and I had to be rushed off campus by motorcycle cops. I felt like a Latin American dictator attempting to escape a revolution. It was really it was quite bizarre. But the reason that I think that it rose is because the Obama administration did a wonderful job of ginning up their base to believe that if your feelings were hurt, it was okay to act out in violence. And that was not restricted to campus issues, like at University of Missouri. It was also taking place in places like Ferguson and places like Baltimore, this idea that if you have grievances, that those grievances can be acted out in a violent way. And we may not agree with the violence, but we sort of get it. I think that had some pretty significant effects on how people thought and what people thought they could get away with. I think that, obviously the heightened political climate has certainly exacerbated a lot of that. I think that, Trump, it's not his fault per se. There are a lot of things I think are Trump's fault. I don't think this is one of them. But the political climate has not made things easier for sure.
Hey, Ben. A couple years ago, you debated the NAACP, correct?
Yes.
Well, no
In
offense to
Seattle,
them, but they're kind of sorry. So when are you going to debate Tariq Nasheed on racism?
I mean, when Tariq Nasheed can gather a crowd larger than 7, so I don't find him to be, honestly, I don't find Tariq Nasheed, from what I've seen online, to be a particularly reasonable advocate of his point of view. I think that there are other people who I'd be interested more in debating. I think a really fascinating debate would be with somebody like Ta-Nehisi Coates, for example. I think that would be a really interesting debate, because I think I really disagree with Ta-Nehisi Coates. I think that he sees things through a false prism. But I think that he's a more intelligent spokesperson for that point of view than Tariq, who seems to be more of a provocateur to me. But I'd consider it. I mean, if there was some group that wanted to sponsor something like that, I'd consider it at least.
Oh, okay. So how would you define the alt-right, and in what kind of objective view could you say it's a minority of the conservative movement?
Okay, so on objective view that it's a minority of the conservative. Okay, so let me first start with the definition and then the statistics. So the definition of the alt-right, there is the colloquial definition of the alt-right, and then there's the specific definition. The specific definition is the alt-right was started by people like Jared Taylor and Richard Spencer. Jared Taylor was the creator of, I believe, American Renaissance, and Richard Spencer was the creator of alternative right. And the idea behind alternative right is that the mainstream right refused to acknowledge specific differences in races that had ramifications for politics is the basic idea, that black people were not as intelligent and were more crime-ridden. This is the basic idea of the alt-right, and that culture is inseparable from race, that Western civilization was a creation of white people, and that other people from different races cannot assimilate into this because there are racial barriers to assimilation. I think all of this is not just stupid, I think it's evil. And so, that's the perspective of the alt-right. It's the core perspective. So what happened is that this was always considered a very fringe movement, right? This is like 5 people. It's like, really, it's a very, very small movement. These are the sort of people who would march in Charlottesville, right? The crowd in Charlottesville was like 1,000 people. There may be 10,000 hardcore members of the alt-right across the country. I know this because I was the #1 target of the alt-right in 2016 on Twitter. I received 7,400 anti-Semitic tweets from the alt-right over the course of about 7 months. According to the Anti-Defamation League, I was the #1 recipient of anti-Semitic tweets on Twitter. So I had a great year last year. It was awesome. But it only came from about 1,100 accounts. It was not coming from a huge variety of people who really believed this stuff. Then the alt-right's definition was broadened. So as the right made what I think is a truly tragic and desperate move from conservatism into just being anti-left, the alt-right started to rise in esteem because these were people who were trolly, right? They like to troll and they like to make memes. And so what they did is they suckered people into believing that if you weren't an establishment conservative and you liked memes, if you liked Harambe memes, if you thought that memes were funny, or if you liked to troll people on Twitter, that this meant that you were a member of the alt-right. So they sort of hid the ball a little bit. They didn't lead with the white supremacism, but they did instead is they said, we're not establishment, we hate the establishment is incompetent, what have they ever done for you? We're people who are fighting for a new tomorrow, and join us, and we hate the left this much. And they would go out and say provocative things, and the left would fight them, and then people would say, oh, well, I hate the left too, so I guess I'm alt-right. I don't like Mitch McConnell also, so I guess I'm alt-right. I know that this was the perspective of a lot of people because in the middle of this, Hugh Hewitt, who's a friend of mine and a talk show host that I respect, Hugh at one point called me a member of the alt-right while I was being targeted by the alt-right. And that's because he thought that I was anti-Mitch McConnell, so I must be alt-right. And I had to explain to him that's not what the alt-right is. So a lot of people were sort of suckered into believing they were members of the alt-right if they don't like Jeb Bush for president, or if they like Donald Trump for president, if they like anyone who's anti-establishment. Sheer nonsense. Sheer nonsense. Right? I was for Ted Cruz for president. I was certainly not for Jeb Bush for president. And that did not make me a member of the alt-right. So there was this widespread perception that the core alt-right was actually bigger than it was because they deliberately hid the ball. One of the people who did this was Milo. Milo went on places like MSNBC, and he said that it's just a trolley group of jolly people who had nothing to do with white supremacism. They just believed in cultural superiority, not racial superiority. Absolutely false. Milo knew better. He was corresponding with the alt-right at the time. And he wrote an entire piece about it. So all of that said, what that led the media to do was then exacerbate the influence of the alt-right because now they had a convenient whipping boy. So now what they could say is everybody on the right is actually alt-right. Right? Everyone who opposed Jeb Bush, they like Donald Trump. That means they're alt-right. And that means that they like Richard Spencer. Well, that's a gap. Right? Just because you like Trump doesn't mean that you like Richard Spencer. So I think that there's a deliberate obfuscation by the media. I think there's some ignorance in the media as to what all these groups mean. And the alt-right remains a very small group. So small that there were people on the so-called alt-right who were disassociating from the alt-right during the Charlottesville rallies. So it's a very, very small group of people who the media keep giving attention to because they hope that we're all like Richard Spencer and not like people who hate Richard Spencer like me.
Hello, Ben. My name is Steven, and I really want to say that you deserve all this popularity you're getting because of the moral objectivism and truth that you preach, and I really think it's refreshing.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
So my question is, I am Coptic Christian, and although I wasn't born in Egypt or I never faced any of the persecution that's currently going on there, I'm still deeply rooted to my culture, and this hatred of cultural appropriation that I'm seeing is an anomaly to me. And I really want to know is why is the left so repulsed at the idea of celebrating culture?
So I think that the left is focusing in on cultural appropriation because, again, this goes back to the idea that we can only identify as members of groups, right? That we can't identify as individuals who can actually supersede our genetics or our environment or the group to which we are born. And so what the left likes to do is because here's the short story of intersectionality. It began a long time ago. The beginnings of intersectionality basically lie in Marxist theory. So Marx believed that there would be a class war that allowed the underclass to destroy the system. That never happened because it turns out capitalism makes everyone wealthier. So instead, the Marxist left decided that they were going to use various racial groups to do this. So in the 1960s, there's a real movement to separate various groups. Women were victimized by the system. Blacks were victimized by the system. And there's truth to some of this, right? In the 1960s, it's not true now. But the idea was that all of these groups were victimized by the system. You bind them all together, and then they will all go fight against the man. And so group identity became paramount. Your identity as a member of the group was the key thing. So Clarence Thomas is not really black because he doesn't act like a quote-unquote real black person because he's conservative. right? And you see that there's even talk that people like me are not really Jewish because I'm on the right, which of course is absurd, especially considering that 70% of Orthodox Jews are on the right. So what the idea here is that if you were to accept cultural appropriation, if you were to accept that we're individuals who can like certain things from different cultures, then those artificial barriers fall immediately. Right? If we can all take from what we like from each other's cultures, then that means as individuals, we are not bound within these false confines that the left has created for us. And so they have to reestablish these segregation notions that we cannot appropriate anything from this culture or this culture, that if something's good for that culture, it must be specific to that culture. All that does is it condemns people to a life of living within certain boundaries that may or may not be good, because certain things from other cultures are fantastic and better than what's in your culture. Cultural appropriation is the story of Western civilization. It's the story, it really is. I mean, it's the story of Western civilization growing and expanding and taking into account other ideas that are better over time. I think that's why Western civilization is so dominant, is because of things like cultural appropriation.
Hey Ben, thank you so much for coming out. My name's Alexander, and I'm a big fan. So I was born in Toronto, and I lived there for 1 year, but I've lived in California for the past 10 years, and I have a dream of becoming a United States Senator when I grow up. But one thing I can't do is become President of the United States, because I'm not a natural-born citizen, and this kind of became a bit of an issue with Ted Cruz in the last election cycle. So what my question really is what I don't understand is, if I'm someone who's lived in this country practically my whole life, worked here, raised a family here, paid taxes here, and potentially served in public office here, I can't become president of the United States. Even Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State, even though he was born in Germany. You can do anything else, run for Senate, governor, congressman, everything else, but I can't be president of the United States. So my question is, do you think I should be able to become president even though I'm not a natural-born citizen? And if so, do you think that it will ever be the case that that's true one day?
So I do think that is a provision of the Constitution that probably will be changed at some point. The original rationale for that provision in the Constitution was because they wanted to make sure that the people who were running for president of the United States did not have foreign allegiances. And so the easiest way to do that was make sure that everybody was actually born in the United States at the time. It was the easiest way to sort of weed people out in an era when half of the people were actually born in Britain or France or other places abroad. I think that as we've moved on as a society, and as there are immigrants who come to the country who are more representative of American values than some people who are born here, I'm not, to be honest with you, I'm not a huge fan of this provision of the Constitution lasting, because I don't think that it's been a very good parchment barrier against people with ideas that are un-American becoming president. So I think that the idea that being born in America is a sort of guarantor of allegiance to the country or to the country's ideals, I don't think that's true. I think that we should do a better job of vetting our candidates so that they have allegiance to the ideals. Yeah, I know there are a lot of conservatives who disagree with this and just sort of like the idea because it's there. I'm not one of these. I'm not wedded to it particularly. So if you're a fan of mine, I would be much happier with you as president than any of the last several.
All right. Hey, Ben. My name is Jacob. I know you're a very religious Orthodox Jew. I'm as well a Coptic Christian. And I feel like the aspect of the left is mostly godless, their principles. So I wanted to know, how can we merge politics and God back into society? Because I feel recently God over the years been really left out. And I think that's why a lot of the liberal, or not liberal, left positions have been taking place.
So I agree with you that the increasing secularism of the United States is the single best indicator for the rise of the political left in the United States. I make virtually all of my arguments not on the basis of religion, but on the basis of secular arguments, because I think that it's a conversation we can have. If I cite the Chumash, or if I cite the Torah, then somebody who doesn't believe that is not going to agree with me just because we have different points of authority. That said, a society that rejects God rejects the fundamental premise of an objective moral standard to which we should all be held accountable. And this is a serious problem. It also, by the way, rejects the logical consequence of rejecting the notion of a God who created us and instilled us with free will. The logical consequence of that notion is that we are basically meaningless balls of meat wandering through the universe. And that this concept comes complete with no form of morality to which we can be held, and comes complete with no sense of responsibility to which we should be held, because balls of meat don't have responsibility. They are just firing synapses in response to their environment. Secular materialism, the sort of atheistic scientific materialism actually undermines many of the causes the left claims to stand for. Like, I don't understand where the left, a secular atheist, I don't understand where a secular atheist gets off explaining about human rights. Where do those come from? On what basis? A rights construct has to come from somebody's moral mind. Okay, and if you are just legitimately an outcome of your DNA and whatever environment is operating on you, and you don't even have free will, then your morality is just an outcome of that too. So how is that moral? How is that more moral than a snake biting a dog? It isn't. And so the idea of a strict secular humanism is self-contradictory. Actually, if you like this topic, I'm writing an entire book on it right now. But the idea that the idea of reason does not exist from a scientific materialist perspective. It doesn't. It's just different synapses firing in your brain. The idea of mind itself doesn't really exist from a scientific materialist perspective. Because how do you identify mind? Right? How do you identify an idea? Where does the idea reside? Why is one idea more important than another idea? All of the fundamental premises that the left has built its entire morality on are built on godly concepts, and now they've rejected God. Right? Even the idea of free will doesn't exist in secular materialism. Right? Sam Harris, who I'm going to be debating on some of this stuff actually in about 3 weeks. I like Sam on a lot of topics, and I hope that we have a good conversation on this. Sam is honest enough in his book about free will to basically say there is none. To which I ask, okay, so why are we bothering with a debate? Right? Because if we're not actually going to be convincing somebody, or if the convincing was predestined from the beginning of time, then I guess that's a purpose, sort of, but not really. So I agree with you. An increasingly secular society has ripped out the moorings upon which it is based, and eventually secular humanism is going to fall into full-scale collectivism in which the majority drive dominates, and that's a dangerous thing.
Hey, Ben. Thanks for coming to hear you speak in person. I'm a big fan, listen to your podcast a lot.
Thank you.
There was one question that you answered a little while ago. It's a little bit out of your wheelhouse, but just wanted to bring it back up because I thought that your answer was a little bit invalid. So basically, you were asked about the morality of killing animals for food, and you basically justified it by saying that killing animals is immoral because I think that human beings have a right to survive and think that we need animal protein to survive as a general matter. I definitely agree that human beings have a right to survive, for sure. But
okay, so we're on the same page there. Okay,
but it's been pretty thoroughly debunked that humans require animal protein to thrive. The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, which is the largest organization of nutritional experts in the world, has basically said that basically a vegan diet is nutritionally adequate at all stages of life, and protein deficiencies are basically non-existent as long as you're eating enough calories. And there's also many vegan athletes that are very successful. So I didn't think that justification that you made was valid. So I was just wondering if you had
That's fair.
any other.
I mean, I'm happy to look at the studies and determine whether I think you're right or not. I mean, again, I think that.
So I'm not assuming you.
Yeah, no. Listen.
I'm just saying, aside from that justification, was there anything else that?
I mean, I do think that there is a fundamental distinction between animal life and human life that actually needs to be upheld. And I don't think that we should go randomly killing animals or mistreating animals. But I think that the idea that a human being is the same as an animal is and I know you're not saying that, but I'm saying that some of that undergirds some elements of sort of the vegan movement, which is that human beings and animals are of equal value, and therefore you can't kill an animal for food. So if the argument is that you don't have a need base for food, then maybe that's true. And if that's the case, then I would actually, I've said before, I think that there's some pretty good arguments for vegetarianism or veganism.
Yeah, it's just the fact that we have readily available alternatives that we
right. So that I think is the best argument for veganism. I think the worst argument for veganism is sort of the PETA argument, the sort of the Holocaust on your plate nonsense. But I do. Again, I think that if we're needlessly killing animals, then I would consider moving away from that. Although I really miss hamburgers, to be honest with you.
Hold it back, hold it. Oh, cool. Hey, so I had a question tonight. I saw the sort of 9-point speech you did about the left being fascist, and
The campus left specifically.
Campus
yes.
left, yeah. And so I felt there was a lot of sort of selective referencing there, which I think obviously makes sense. That's, the argument that you're making. One that I thought sort of really stood out objectively that was sort of wrong was the idea that the left was more like sort of prone to conspiracy theories and that sort of idea.
Well, so, you notice I did say there are some on the right who are too. So now we get to talk about it in the Q&A. So I'm excited.
Exactly. So, what I think of is when you look at like sort of like, like the statistics, like you measure like, Donald Trump supporters who believe Barack Obama was a Muslim, believe that global warming isn't real, believe that the Earth is, 8,000 years old, believe that we didn't evolve, believe those sorts of things. It's like demonstrably higher on the right than it is on the left in terms of like very clearly measurable.
It depends on the conspiracy theory, right? So if you go back to the Bush administration, then left beliefs about conspiracies surrounding 9/11 or about WMDs in Iraq and all this kind of stuff, very high. So it really does depend on the conspiracy theory. And as I said, I think there's conspiratorial thinking on both sides. I don't think that's unique to the left. What I was saying is that on the campus, it's more prevalent on the left than it is on the right with regard to big elements of American society. So I think that you're right. There are a number of, you're right, the polls say that a lot of Republicans say that Obama is actually a Muslim and was born in Kenya, and that's a silly conspiracy theory. Yeah, exactly. The Seth Rich Pizzagate nonsense. That crap is prevalent on the right. Conspiracy theories, unfortunately, I think conspiracy theories have actually become a way of life because I don't think that, how do I phrase this? I think a lot of the right is not actually conservative. And the reason that I say that is because I think a lot of the right has become anti-left, and what that means is that if you're mostly anti-something, you tend to attribute conspiratorial thinking to that group of people. So I think that, so maybe I'm falling for the no true Scotsman fallacy here a little bit by saying that real conservatives don't tend to buy into conspiratorial thinking. But I think that we live in an era, unfortunately, when politics is motivated by anger, and unjustified anger on all sides is being justified by politicians. And so a lot of people have a lot of different conspiracy theories. But let's put it this way. It's not absent on the campus left. It's very prevalent on the campus left. Yeah, ask a follow-up. Go for it.
Cool. Yeah. So I guess, one thing on like, the no true conservatives believe that, I could say the same thing, no true Democrats believe that 9/11 was done by, the Bush administration. So it's the same sort of thing.
No, but how many true Democrats believe that Bush lied, people died?
I think Bush
all of them
did lie, though. Right? I feel like there's pretty you can watch sort of like him saying something and something else, but that's sort of
no. You cannot watch him saying that there are WMDs in Iraq and attribute that to deliberate lying unless you are also willing to attribute that deliberate lying to your own party. Okay, everyone on the left made the same contention, including Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton and Chuck Schumer and Nancy, but they all made the same contention. No one says that they were lying. They only say that Bush was lying because that's politically convenient, and they think there was a conspiracy. Here's a more common one that's easier for you. Okay, how many people on the left believe it was war for oil? Okay, that's supremely common on the left. If it was war for oil, why didn't we get any oil? So, I mean, this is what I'm saying. I mean, I think the conspiracy theories have become, as politics has become more partisan, and as we've looked at each other as enemies rather than friends, we tend to attribute bad motivations to our enemies.
Hi, Ben. My name is Louis. I'm a huge fan. You're my conservative political mentor. I'm a Daily Wire subscriber and listen to you every day. My question is, as a conservative Latino, thank you. As a conservative Latino in a divisive world that seems to be going literally black and white on every issue, how does conservatism, the movement, and how does the conservative movement bring about more Latinos to the conservative cause?
So, I mean, I think that it really is a matter of promulgating perspectives that everyone can buy into. So I spoke at the California Republican Convention maybe 4 years ago now, 3-4 years ago. And in my keynote, I actually suggested that conservatives should learn Spanish. Specifically, not because I think that Latinos who don't speak English shouldn't learn English. I think everybody should learn English. But I also think that conservatism's message is not restricted to one language. And so I've been diligently failing at attempting to learn Spanish ever since. But I think that one of the things that I agree with you that there is an entertainment aspect to some of conservatism that says the more extreme position you take, the more popular you will be. I don't think that's right. I think that it's not about the extremism of the position that you take. I think it's about the truth of the position that you take and the strength of conviction with which you say it. So I don't actually think that Donald Trump won because he was the most conservative candidate. I think he won because he said things in the clearest fashion. They may even be the wrong things in many cases, I believe. But he said them in the clearest fashion, and he said them with the most passion. And I think that does make a difference. That's unfortunately how sort of our lizard brain works, is that we respond to that. So if you say the right things with that same level of passion and intensity, then I think that people hear it. So, with regard to immigration, I've always taken the position on immigration that I do not have any objections to legal immigration whatsoever, so long as people are not on welfare and they're willing to assimilate to American values, including founding ideals. You do that, come on in. And what I've always said with regard to illegal immigrants is that we live in Los Angeles, so if you live in Los Angeles, you know and have worked with illegal immigrants. What I've always said with regard to illegal immigrants is that it is a crime, obviously, to jump the border, but the idea that everyone is jumping the border to commit crime is obviously not true. The vast majority of people who are jumping the border to create a better life for their families. Does that justify jumping the border? Not from an American point of view. We still get to select who comes into the United States. We're still a sovereign land, and we get to decide who comes in. With that said, the people who are already here, we should determine on a case-by-case basis whether the United States would be better with them in or out, and then we should either put them at the back of the line or kick them out. Right? If you deserve to be here, we'll put you at the back of the line. You get to wait just like everybody else. But if you don't deserve to be here, then we kick you out. But we do it on a case-by-case basis. I think one of the mistakes that people make is they're always talking about people in terms of class. So you get this debate. All illegal immigrants should stay, or all illegal immigrants should go. Why? How about the ones we like stay and the ones we don't go? That's the way we do the rest of our immigration program. And I think that most people who are Latino and citizens in the United States agree with that. I mean, Latino people in the United States don't want people who are coming here with bad motives to come here no matter where they're coming from either. So I think that it's a mistake in how people talk about immigration, again, thinking that the extremism of their position can substitute for the clarity and passion of their position.
Hey, so first I'd like to thank UCPD and everyone that organized this event, because I was at Milo, a year and a half ago, and it was an absolute mess, but this was really smooth, so really
thank you to the police
really
particularly.
Well. So as a Jew, I've noticed a pretty concerning rise in either the incidence or visibility of anti-Semitism over the last year or 2 years. Both in the bona fide sense, like the people in Charlottesville and the Daily Stormer folks and all the alt-right folks, and in a much more casual sense from many people on the campus left, like that cartoon at Berkeley a couple weeks ago, all the BDS stuff, and the equation of Israel with Jews and anti-Israel sentiment being essentially anti-Semitism.
Yes.
Which, as someone who has been a victim of anti-Semitism from both sides, which one are you more concerned about, if either, and why?
Much more concerned with the anti-Semitism of the left and not just some on the right. The reason I'm more concerned with the anti-Semitism on the left is because I think it's closer to the heart of the left, meaning that the anti-Semites on the left, people like Keith Ellison, he was almost the head of the DNC. The BDS movement has become a hallmark of the campus left. I mean, it's growing in strength on a lot of campuses around the country, and it's being used as a rallying point, as almost sort of an anti-Western rallying point by a lot of folks on the left. The leftist perspective on Israel is basically that Israel is bad because Israel is prosperous and rich, and it is an outpost of Western civilization in a non-Western part of the world, and therefore it's colonialist. That is really an anti-Western position. I don't think it's any coincidence that when UC students tried to pass a divestment petition, they also tried to divest at Berkeley from the United States, which would have been weird, because then they would have had to float about 100 feet off the ground in order to fully divest from the United States, although we have air rights, I believe. But in any case, I'm more worried about that because by statistics, the movement against toward an anti-Israel position, toward a pro-Hamas position is much stronger on the left than it is on the right. That said, the growth of this kind of alt-right, paleo-conservative, isolationism, anti-Israel thing has really taken a lot of people by surprise. I do think it's a minority movement inside the conservative movement. I mean, even a lot of places that are considered kind of alt-right friendly, like take Breitbart where I used to work, that's a very pro-Israel publication. Right? It's been, I think, horribly friendly to a lot of folks on the alt-right in a disgusting way, which is one of the reasons I've been ripping on them for a year. And one of the reasons why I think Milo is a terrible example for that site. But Milo himself is not anti-Israel, and neither is Breitbart. And so the kind of growth of the specific anti-Jewish movement, I think is, let's put it this way, I think it's more specific on the alt-right, and I think it's broader but deeper on the left. I think there's a select group of people on the right who are really openly anti-Semitic and hate me and send me death threats and send me memes about my kids being gassed in gas chambers and all this kind of crap. But on the left, what's closer to the heart of the Democratic Party is an anti-religious bigotry and an anti-Israel stance that is much more dangerous to Jews in the long run.
Hi, Ben. So earlier tonight and throughout a lot of the videos I've seen you in, you've made comments about how the government is, incompetent, incapable, generally bloated. And being a libertarian myself, I couldn't agree with you more. So my question is, which of your positions that aren't direct, life, liberty, property, natural rights protections, which of them do you think the government should be stepping in, and why should we have this bloated, incompetent government stepping in on those positions?
So we shouldn't have the bloated, incompetent government, particularly on the federal level, stepping in. I think local government is a slightly different issue because it's closer to home. So I have a sort of Montesquieu position on the role of local government. So I said earlier about spending on mental health facilities, for example. I specifically mean local facilities. I don't mean federal facilities, because local government tends to be a little bit less inefficient than federal. Like, the bigger the government gets and the more distant it gets from the people who actually elect it, the less you know your legislators, the less you know the people who are in charge of the money, the more inefficient the government tends to get and the more bloated it tends to get. So I think that there can be the idea, and the founders thought this too, there could be baseline kind of social safety nets. These did exist in colonial America, but these existed at the very, very local level, and particularly at the communal level. So my ideal is that they don't exist from the government at all, right? My ideal is that they exist in the religious community. This is why I think libertarians ought to embrace the idea of powerful social institutions like churches that are actually there taking care of poor people. But if that's not there, then local communities are going to have to, take care of. There are certain groups of people who just can't take care of themselves, and if they fall through the cracks, then that's a referendum on the local community. So. But beyond that, I don't think that the federal government has a role in nearly anything, neither did the founders, which is why the Constitution is, a 5,700-word document that governs the entirety of the federal government.
Thank you.
Hey, Ben. I appreciate your podcasts. They get me through LA traffic, so that's good.
I'll have to double the length, yeah.
Also, I was a member of the Bruin Republicans when I was here, so I'm glad to see they're still doing these kind of things.
And much bigger now than they were when we were here.
Yeah, much bigger now. It was like 7 people when I was here. I actually emailed you to get another ticket for my rabbi, a member of a local Orthodox shul. He told me not to ask this because I'd lose, but I'm going to do it anyways. It's about abortion.
Okay.
And so.
Yeah, you're going to lose. But go ahead.
Okay, so here we go. Talmudic law states that an embryo is not deemed fully viable until the 40th day. And then Jewish mourning rites don't apply to an unborn child. The embryo is treated as an appendage. And Rashi, which I know you know.
Yeah, this is a machlok between Rashi and Rambam.
Right, and Rashi said that it's considered.
Not to get too abstruse, folks.
Right. Let's just say it's till the 40th day. That's not the moment of creation because, he talked about bones and whatnot and arteries forming. Also in the Exodus, they talked about how if 2 men get in a fight and a woman who's pregnant loses a child, he owes her the equivalent of an appendage. So my question to you is, you always talk about drawing a line in the sand. Where do you draw the line in the sand, the moment of inception, or creation, whatever? So the line is 40 days. According to Rashi, according to Talmudic law, why not draw the line at 40? Why do you disagree with that?
Okay, I disagree with that because basic biology does not draw any distinction at 40 days. So I think that Talmudic commentators who are writing in 70 CE are less knowledgeable about basic biology than we are now. They didn't have ultrasounds. They didn't know what was going on in the womb. There's some pretty bad science in the Talmud, to be frank. There's some pretty bad science in Rambam. I think Rambam would have been one of the first people to actually suggest that modern science ought to be taken at face value. That said, even in the Talmud, there's no notion that you can abort at will before 40 days. So there's serious halachic authorities, not to get too deep into Jewish law, but there are serious halachic authorities, many of them, who have talked about the availability and use of abortion before 40 days, and the vast majority decision, from what I understand, is that it is essentially forbidden except in exigent circumstances. So they set a different standard with regard to is it a life or is it not a life, Talmudically, but that doesn't actually change the behavior of whether you're allowed to obtain an abortion by choice before 40 days.
So one follow-up, assuming not that the mom.
By the way, I don't form my opinions. This is one of these issues where I don't form my opinions on secular law based on what the Talmud says, and in fact, I think the Talmud is actually logically incorrect here.
Well, let's just say
which is heresy, but
right, but not talking about the mother's life being in danger, because we put that one aside for a second. Even Eliezer Yudah Wallenberg, one of the guys who was on the Supreme.
Wallenberg is extraordinarily liberal on these issues.
So then he said abortion is okay if you have tay-sachs or deformities.
And he's a real outlier on these issues. I mean, I don't really want to get into abstruse insider Jewish community debates, but he's a real outlier on these issues, Wallenberg. And he's taken some very extreme stances on that, on things like transgenderism. He's taken extreme stances. He's much more socially left than the vast majority of halachic authorities.
We'll leave it for shul then.
I think it's probably a better idea.
One last thing I just wanted to say. This isn't a Trump shirt. It actually says Seinfeld Costanza.
Oh, no, I can read it from there, and I'm all for it.
Just so you know who I am.
Hi, Ben. Biggest and earliest fan from overseas Hong Kong. Sorry for the bad English. Started watching you 5 years back before you became legendary. But somehow I managed to luckily end up in UCLA and have a chance to see you. So I have 2 disagreements with you. I agree with you that a flat tax is sort of moral, but on a practical level, I don't think the middle class and the lower sectors, they're going to do that well, and they're going to have a significant financial burden. How do you address that? And the second question is, you spend a lot of your time on the Daily Wire destroying the left and dealing with the people calling you racist, xenophobe, homophobe, xenophobe, Islamophobe, whatever, a lot of things, and then who put you in danger as well. I have the unpopular opinion this is actually a very good thing, because like back in Hong Kong, it's like 16% people talk about poverty, or today there's an earthquake in Iran, Iraq that killed 500 people. I don't think like many people know about this. So why do you have such a, like, I would say like a disproportionate level of outrage at issues that aren't that much on the Daily Wire?
Okay, well, I mean, I think that, the issues, with regard to the problems of the left, the reason I have disproportionate outrage is for the same reason that, I'm outraged when someone steals a car a mile away from me. I'm more outraged when someone breaks into my house and starts robbing my fridge. And the left is seeking to destroy a lot of the foundational values that I think the country stands for, and that's happening in real time to the most powerful country on earth, and as America goes, so goes the future of the planet. So that's why I spend a disproportionate amount of time fighting what I think are bad ideas, by the way, on the left and also on places like the alt-right. As far as the first question, which remind me, the first question.
The flat taxes.
Flat tax. Okay, so the flat tax question. So I've said that I think a flat tax is moral because I think percentages are percentages. But as far as the efficacy of a flat tax, one of the suggestions has been that there should be basically an elimination of all tax for people below a certain level, and then a flat tax from there on up. I don't think that's completely wrong. I think that's acceptable. But again, I think that the idea of a progressive tax, where you pay more the more you make, is both immoral and also bad economics. So.
Thank you.
Hey Ben, huge fan and proud owner of a Tumblr.
Then you know its glories, don't you?
Yes, I do. But I work at a middle school where I see teachers day in and day out praise the leftist way of thinking and bash the conservative way of thinking. And I just want to know what you suggest I would do to not necessarily promote conservatism, but to just kind of keep a objective viewpoint with teaching the kids.
I mean, so I think that the question is sort of two-part, even though it really isn't. The first part is, how do you do this without getting fired? Right? I mean, that really is the question. One of the big problems at the public school level is that in California, you have to be a member of the teachers union to teach in a public school, and that's a disaster because the teachers unions are really discriminatory against people on the right, and they obviously take all your money and they spend it on leftist politicians like Jerry Brown, and it's a serious problem. That's a question you're going to have to decide for yourself. How far can you go without getting fired? As far as what you can say to the kids, I think that it's perfectly fine to say, here's an argument I heard one of your other teachers making today. It's a valid argument. Let me explain where I think it's mistaken. And if the other teacher has a problem with that, then let them talk with you about it in front of the class. Like this idea that you get a free field to say whatever you want in a classroom without ever being contradicted, I think is incredibly stupid. And I think it's damaging to the kids because especially, honestly, I think that one of the reasons that the left is actually vulnerable on campus, even though they seem invulnerable on campus, I think this is true in high schools and junior highs as well, they never hear a good position on the right. So when they finally hear a good position on the right, a lot of them are convinced because they've never actually had to deal with those ideas before. If they had to deal with these ideas and actually debate for themselves whether they're true or not, they get a better perspective on where maybe they actually stand. So I would just suggest really going directly at it and saying, you may have heard from your teacher this. Here's the counter perspective. You can believe that other teacher, but here's the counter perspective and the data to back it up.
Quick follow-up question. I was just wondering if I could get a handshake.
As you see, I'm diseased. So you actually don't want a handshake, but from afar, I shake your hand. I appreciate it.
Hi, thank you for coming. I was wondering about the actual speech you gave on the authoritarianism, and one of the things that should us conservatives are usually defined in our ideology is respect towards the authority of traditional institutions like family and religion, and just traditionalism in general.
Right.
In fact, it's often interchangeable with some modes of conservatism. So my question is, where does respect for tradition end and authoritarianism begin?
At the point of a gun, is what I would say, and the point of silencing other people. So I think that we ought to have tremendous respect for tradition. In fact, I cited this to someone earlier today. I think that Chesterton has a great kind of distinction between the left and the right. What he says is that for the leftist walks through a field and sees a fence and says, I don't see any reason for this fence to be here, I'm tearing it out. And for somebody who's conservative, they walk through the field, they see the fence, they say, I don't know why this fence is here. I'm gonna find out why the fence is here, and then maybe I'll tear it out. And I think that that's the appropriate position to take on virtually every policy when it comes to changing the past. The burden of proof is on you to show that making the change is going to improve society. The burden is not on the rule to prove itself. That said, the respect for authority in conservatism only goes so far, right? The founders were revolutionaries who rebelled against an existing regime, and they were the founders of what I would say is American conservatism and constitutional philosophy. So you respect authority insofar as it is right, but you also don't impose from above rules that violate basic concepts of free will and are not in defense of life, liberty, or property. I would say that's where the distinction lies.
All right, guys, it looks like we have time for one more question, so this is the last one.
So lucky. Thank you, Ben, for being here. Really enjoyed your debate at Politicon, destroying Zenk. That was
well, thank
hilarious.
you for coming. I appreciate it.
So my question for you is, I read about a lawsuit filed against Harvard by Asian Americans in 2014 and 15, saying that basically Asians are held to a higher standard when being considered for admissions to Harvard and other Ivy League schools.
Yes.
The stat shows that Asians have to earn 140 points more than whites on SATs, while they don't show any obvious lacking of extracurriculars or leadership experiences. So do you think that's somehow an institutional racism against Asian Americans? And is that an irony where affirmative action really hurts minority group, which is Asian Americans?
Yes.
Thank you.
So the short answer is yes. I think affirmative action is a racist policy in its general notion. And I think that it does particularly affect Asian Americans. For a long time, it affected Jews actually in the same way. There were quotas on Jews at major universities because Jews were outperforming the typical. And therefore, Harvard Law School, for a long time, had quotas on the number of Jews that would be allowed into Harvard. So yes, Asians, by virtually all the studies that I've seen, are expected to outperform other people on the SATs in order to go to the same schools. And income doesn't seem to matter. I remember when I was in college, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal about an Asian American kid who grew up in a single parent family, very impoverished, had SAT points 200 points high, scores 200 points higher than a black kid similarly situated. The black kid got in, the Asian didn't. And that is institutional racism, because the assumption is that if you're Asian, you must have grown up more prosperous or in a more solid two-parent family. And of course, that's nonsense. Everybody's an individual. So yes, I think that when I gave my intersectional hierarchy, Asians fall very low on the intersectional hierarchy, specifically because Asian Americans have done incredibly well as a general group. Now, obviously, there are distinctions between Asian communities. Not all people from the general continent of Asia have equal levels of success in the United States. There are significant differences even between Koreans and Chinese and Vietnamese. But with all of that said, overall, Asians are being discriminated against in the educational system, and that is racism. Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's good to be back home.